Hi everyone, and welcome back to a special edition of the Astro Insights blog video casts. I'm going to be looking at the astrology of the coronation of King Charles III, which happens on the 6th of May 2023. The reason I'm doing this is because obviously there's a lot going on astrologically, particularly with regard to the two eclipses that we are currently experiencing. The April-May eclipses in Aries and Scorpio. And there's some fascinating links back to other events in Charles's life that are related to these eclipses, as well as some interesting synastry between his mother and his own astrology, and also eclipses in relation to her coronation. So there's some really interesting stuff going on, and I thought it was worth having a look. So I'm going to try and keep this brief. I probably will be writing an article about it as well on the Astro Insights blog. But anyway, let's just dive in and I'll show you what I can see. So as we know from my previous forecasts, generally for me, lunar eclipses are about closing things out, coming full circle, and the Oroboros, or cosmic serpent, seems to be a particularly strong theme for this set of eclipses. Now, they happen in the signs of Aries and Scorpio, and those are both kind of Mars ruled, and it ties into the hexagram that is activated by this particular eclipse, which is hexagram 1, and in the I Ching that represents the cosmic dragon, which is the kind of primal yang force, the force of creation. And you can see it in all sorts of serpent-like things, from ley lines to rivers to the sort of lava rivers that you get coming out of a volcano. And I think it's interesting that the Oroboros, as the sort of the alchemical symbol of kind of beginnings and endings and of cycles, is so strong now, because this particular eclipse that happens on the 5th of May, so the day before Charles's coronation, really does kind of epitomize the closing out of the sort of the end of the Queen's reign, his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and kind of clears away the energy, so that the new beginning that was kind of ushered in by that Aries solar eclipse at the end of April can really start to sort of take hold. And I want to kind of look at that, and I want to look at the links between this eclipse and the Saros families, and as well as the synastry between family members, particularly Charles and his late mother, the Queen. And then, of course, the sun and the moon as the sort of alchemical symbols of kingship. So there's a lot in this to sort of unpack. But just for those who don't really know how I kind of work, lunar eclipses for me are all about endings. So they turbocharge full moons. They always happen at a full moon. And full moons for me generally are about kind of endings, culmination points, climaxes, and conclusions. So things tend to either kind of come to their fullest expression, or they tend to be sort of phasing out. And this usually happens over a 3-month period or so. That's my kind of window for the sort of the reach of lunar eclipses. Solar eclipses are a little bit longer. They are 6-month cycles. And what tends to happen is that the lunar eclipse will close out the solar eclipse cycle of the previous 6 months or so. That's what usually happens. Not always, because we don't always have the same amount of eclipses every year, but that's the kind of general rule. So this one will be closing out the cycle that began in October of 2022. But as I said, there may also be ties back to that lunar eclipse of 2022, the May one, and in turn to the eclipses of 2005. But, as I said, we start with this lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which happens literally the day before the coronation on the 5th of May 2023, but essentially at the beginning of the bank holiday weekend here in the UK, that's been sort of designated to celebrate this particular event. I mean, it is a kind of once-in-a-lifetime event. If you think about how long the Queen reigned for, she reigned from 1953 onwards. Many people will not see this type of event happen again in quite some time. So I think it's one of those kind of pivotal moments for the United Kingdom, for the royal family, and what better way to sort of exemplify this than a lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which is of course the sign of Charles's son. So very, very interesting symbolism going on here. Now, this particular lunar eclipse I have kind of grouped with the 12 North Saros series using the Vandenberg 141 series, which allows me to sort of key the lunar eclipses back into the series of solar eclipses that make up Bernadette Brady's Saros system of 12 North. Now this is an interesting one because it carries the signature of a Saturn-Moon sextile, which is quite positive. And Bernadette Brady interprets this as being about opportunities to take on greater responsibility. A promotion, a title, or a position of authority may be offered to you quite suddenly. And as with the 6 North series, which we had last year at that solar eclipse in April, this may be due to the bearer suddenly becoming incapacitated or not being able to continue for some reason. So interesting, as I say, this overlap with last year's eclipses, which were also in similar signs. You know, we had that lunar eclipse in, I think it was in Scorpio in May. And we had that 6 North Saros series that was activated, as I said. And as we'll see here, this was the partial solar eclipse that happened on the 30th of April 2022. So in the sign of Taurus, because at that stage we were still in the middle of the kind of Taurus-Scorpio set of eclipses. You know, the eclipses normally happen in a 2 to 2.5 year period in the same signs, the same kind of polarity of signs, and then they regress because the nodes are moving backwards through the zodiac, anti-clockwise. So we had this eclipse, you know, in that was part of the 6 North series, and this would have covered the period from April through to the autumn, which is of course when the Queen passed away. And at the time when I did my forecast, I did say that I thought that the younger members of the royal family would have to sort of take up more responsibility from the Queen, who was increasingly frail. And this is exactly what the Saros series was about stepping up, about accepting more commitments and responsibilities because of somebody else being ill or not able to fulfill their duties for various reasons. So it's really, really interesting. So, and as we know, the Queen passed away in September of 2022, but what's so interesting is that her coronation, much like Charles's coronation, was also kind of precipitated by a solar eclipse. So if we kind of go back to 1953, she was forced to take on the role of Queen unexpectedly after her uncle first abdicated, you know, Edward VII, I think, who abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. And then his brother, King George, took over, the Queen's father. And unfortunately, he died prematurely when she was just 21. So this was in February, it's the 6th of February 1953. He passed away when she was on tour, and she was forced to sort of come back early and succeed him to the throne. And this was not really what had been planned for her. So it was quite a surprise in a lot of ways. And so it's interesting that her coronation, the first eclipse that sort of preceded her coronation, was a solar eclipse in Aquarius on the 14th of February 1953, so on Valentine's Day. And it had Uranus, ruler of those luminaries, conjunct her Pluto North Node conjunction in the 6th house of kind of work and service. So that kind of speaks of suddenly having to take on a role due to the sudden or dramatic ending or the death of somebody else. Now, what's interesting is that Pluto rules her midheaven, and on the midheaven is Saturn. And this Uranus was trine to her natal Saturn, which is smack bang on her midheaven. So this does suggest having to sort of take on the burden or the sort of the responsibility of the monarchy as a result of a death, because of course Saturn and Pluto are both very strong planets associated with death, transformation and rebirth. So it's interesting how Uranus, the sort of unpredictable planet of sudden fated events, was conjunct her North Node, which is very symbolic of, you know, our kind of destiny or our fate, and that this forced her to take on this duty, which is symbolized by Saturn. And, you know, I also think that the overlap in terms of the date is interesting. You know, her father dying on the 6th of February and this eclipse happening just a week later. Now, what's also fascinating is that her coronation was the first to be televised. This is quite a modern development, which is very Uranian, actually. So that's interesting. So that happened on the 2nd of June, 1953. And this coronation was bookended by these two eclipses. So the solar one in Aquarius on the 14th of February, and then there was this another solar eclipse in Cancer on the 11th of July. And this again accentuated that natal Pluto nodal conjunction that I was talking about, that Uranus kind of set off. Chiron was rising on the ascendant, which I think, again, is very poignant. It sort of points to the sadness and grief of losing her father. And, of course, now Charles is kind of taking on the role of king, but he's also mourning the passing of his mother. And so there's a strong family theme around the whole thing as well, which I think is quite fascinating. The other thing that's interesting is that the February 1953 event formed part of an eclipse series that was actually in the process of being phased out, called Old North. So there's this sense of, with her coronation too, the old guard kind of being phased out, the sort of the patriarchal sort of old guard represented by her father and his brother. And I mean, there've been a lot of people that have talked about, the potential end of the monarchy, but they always seem to be able to sort of evolve and reinvent themselves. And I think this is a very Uranian theme, and it's something that is strongly in the signature of this upcoming lunar eclipse as well. So that's quite interesting. And then just briefly looking at the Queen's chart in relation to that 2022 lunar eclipse in Scorpio, just because I thought it might be interesting to consider. And you can see that we've also got Pluto rising in the first house, this time in Capricorn, of course, which is the sign of old age. And Pluto is in essence opposing her natal Pluto here in the 6th house. So that can sometimes indicate, death or kind of passing on. Although astrologers generally don't like to make those kind of predictions because they are very sort of, first of all, very morbid, and secondly, they are sort of very difficult to get right. So that's interesting, that there is this sense of a monumental change kind of underway here. So this was in May 2022, and of course she passed away in September of the same year. And then what else is interesting is that moon, that lunar eclipsed moon in Scorpio, along with the South Node and the part of Fortune, are the only planets that are above the horizon. And they do sit smack bang on that Saturn on her midheaven in Scorpio that we can see here. So to me, it is very symbolic of the end of her reign, that's going to come within the sort of 3 to 6 months of this event. And, as I say, she kind of died several months later in September. So in that sense, also kind of bringing things full circle, if you like. Her reign starting with a solar eclipse and her reign ending with a lunar eclipse, so very in keeping with the symbolism that I've already kind of talked about. And then I think what's also interesting is that we do have the part of Fortune here. And I mean, she was the longest serving British monarch, and she did manage to live to see her platinum jubilee, which we celebrated, last summer. And so I think that's that part of Fortune, that sense of that celebration of the end of her life and of her reign, that sort of brought everything kind of beautifully to a close, a kind of a perfect ending, if you like. Now, moving forward, as I was saying, the current 6-month cycle that we're in, the solar lunar cycle, was set off by the Aries solar eclipse that happened on the 20th of April. Now, this will take us, as I say, into the autumn. But what's so fascinating from the point of view of Charles and the coronation is that it forms part of the 7 North Saros series, the very same family of eclipses that took place on the 8th of April 2005, which was the day before Charles married Camilla. So, as I say, really, really interesting that we've got the solar eclipse happening just before his coronation, now in 2023, and the one before that in the same sign and Saros family happened the day before he got married to Camilla. So another important rite of passage in his life. So it's really fascinating how eclipses seem to mark these rites of passage for him so clearly. What's also interesting is that this was the last set of eclipses that had this this kind of unusual Aries-Scorpio combination. So we had a solar eclipse in Aries on the 8th of April 2005, and then this was followed by a lunar eclipse in Scorpio on the 24th of April 2005. So there may well be parallels between, these two events. I mean, I think what's so interesting about the current eclipse and the two lunar eclipses is that they fall in Scorpio, and of course Charles is a sun sign Scorpio, so that's pretty interesting. And then the other thing, of course, is that there's this link to hexagram 3 or gate 3 in human design. Now, this is interesting because it's called difficulty in the beginning. So, it does suggest that, he may take a while to sort of find his feet. But, of course, he has been sort of auditioning for the role for quite some time. So, I don't think it'll take him too long. But this particular gate, which is where the Aries eclipse happened, also happens to be important in terms of Charles and the late Queen's charts, because Charles has his moon in Taurus here, and the late Queen has had her sun in the same gate. So it's really, really interesting that, there's this strong emphasis on hexagram 3. And of course, hexagram 3 in the I Ching is all about kind of new shoots that are sort of pushing up through the soil and are kind of are still young and tender and green and are still sort of finding their way. And I think it's so interesting that on his coronation invitation, he chose to use the symbol of the green man, which of course is very evocative certainly in sort of English pagan traditions around May Day, spring rites, that type of thing. And of course for him it symbolizes kind of new beginnings, that sort of spring energy, which is very much epitomized by hexagram 3. So I think that's quite fascinating. It will also be the very same gate where Jupiter will ingress into Taurus later this month on the 16th of May, and that begins a sort of a new year-long cycle that will last until next May 2024. So also quite interesting. Now, the eclipse that happened on the 20th of April, that Aries solar eclipse, happened in the 7 North Saros series. And this is associated with that volcanic energy that I was talking about, at the time, that sort of Venus-Mars-Pluto energy. And it's interesting that passion was a sort of a big theme. And, that's one of the ways that Charles kind of describes himself. I was watching a documentary about him just the other night. And, one of the things that sort of characterizes him is his kind of passion, and his passion for, the environment, for conservation, his passion for art and music. And I think this is a strong theme that we're going to see coming through in his reign right from the beginning, is that he's going to sort of like maintain his interest in the things that he's passionate about, such as, as I say, environmental conservation, leaving a legacy for the next generation, that kind of thing. So I think that's something to watch for as his reign kind of unfolds. So moving on to the coronation chart itself, there's quite a lot of significant things to sort of note. So first of all, as I say, it does occur one day after this lunar eclipse in Scorpio, which I do think is symbolic of the ending of the Queen's reign. If you think about the moon as being about queens, about females, about mothers, this kind of, it's almost like a chapter closes and then a new one opens on the 6th. What else is interesting is that the moon, by the time we get to the coronation, is now at 24 degrees of Scorpio. It will be at about 14 or so at the time of the eclipse. So it moves to 24. And of course, Charles has got his natal sun at about 22, I think, of Scorpio. So the moon will be within 2 degrees of his sun. So that's quite interesting. And then what else is interesting is that we've got Leo rising in the chart, and we had something similar in the coronation of the Queen. We also had Leo rising, and of course Leo is the sign of the sovereign or the king or queen. And it also happens to be Charles's rising sign, Charles and Camilla actually. So that's fascinating because of course she will also be crowned as queen or queen consort. And I think it's almost the same degree. So really interesting kind of synastry between these two charts. And then we've got the sun opposite, obviously, coming off of its opposition to the moon in Taurus. And you can see right next to it is Uranus. And Uranus in this chart happens to rule the descendant. Now Uranus combined with the sun can sometimes be a little bit unpredictable, and I think we've already seen that in terms of the people's reaction to the idea of taking a pledge to the king. There's already been some kind of ructions on social media with people saying, that they, they don't see why they should have to take a pledge of allegiance to the king. He should take one to them. Getting very sort of Republican and sort of French Revolution, which I think is interesting. And given that Uranus rules the descendant, and we've got Pluto approaching the descendant, you can see Pluto here, currently retrograde in Aquarius. It's recently ingressed. I think it ingressed in sort of March or so. And this is going to begin a sort of like a 20-year cycle, which I've kind of talked about in an article on the Astro Insights blog. You might find it interesting because it does bring up a lot of themes around things like, the people, the populace, versus the monarchy. I mean, you can see that with that sort of Leo Aquarius polarity, as well as a lot of themes around not just humanitarian stuff, which I mean, if you think of the royal family, does a lot of humanitarian and charity work. So I don't think that will sort of change. If anything, it's likely to increase. But what I do think is interesting is that Charles is already taking steps to modernize the monarchy and to make reparations as far as things like colonialism is concerned. Because, of course, the monarchy is associated strongly with empire, particularly Queen Victoria's reign. So there's a lot of kind of reparations that need to happen, and he and William are already taking steps to sort of address that. But it also kind of brings to the fore themes around the kind of these two sort of themes that tend to run through human history, and they tend to be the sort of the liberal kind of humanitarianism of the Enlightenment on one hand, so that this kind of obsession with progress and with democracy and with humanity on the one hand, and then the sort of the need to preserve tradition on the other hand, which is often represented by Saturn. And these two things often sort of work hand in hand. That they tend to sort of dance. The one tends to sort of emphasize freedom, egalitarianism, and puts progress and modernity at the center of things, science and that kind of thing. And then on the other hand, you've got this idea of tradition, which I think the Brits are so good at. And, I think in a lot of ways, I read a book recently by Tim Staples, in which he talks about the sort of the function of tradition, how it connects us to the past, gives us a sense of identity, and provides continuity between the generations. And I think in a lot of respects the monarchy does that. It does it as an archetypal family. You get this idea of sort of one generation succeeding the next. And I think for the British psyche, it's really important that we have the monarchy to kind of hold these traditions and ceremonies and rituals that connect us to the past, and help to sort of keep British culture sort of alive, and the sense of kind of continuity. But of course the trick is to also keep evolving, to keep adapting to changing times. And I think that's something that Charles talked about himself, that there's always this need for the monarchy to evolve and to sort of change and to modernize. And I think we'll see that probably quite radically under his rulership. He has already changed a lot himself as the Prince of Wales. He kind of became financially independent by setting up things like the Duchy of Cornwall, and growing his own kind of crops, and starting businesses that would allow him to become more self-sufficient and use this money from the taxpayer. And he was also considered, a lot of people made fun of him in terms of his interest in things like gardening, talking to plants, alternative medicine, and various things, particularly conservation, and in a lot of ways he's been proven to be ahead of his time. So I think it's kind of interesting, that combination of the Sun Uranus, and it'll be interesting to see how it kind of unfolds over time. So that's something else to to bear in mind. One thing I will say is that as far as objections to the monarchy are concerned, we can see that epitomized by this opposition between the Sun and Uranus on one side and then the Moon on the other. The Moon can represent the populace in mundane astrology. So I think it's kind of interesting that it's here close to the fourth house cusp. And in this chart, it's interesting that it's intercepted in the 12th house, which can be the house of the collective, but it doesn't actually rule a house cusp. So that's quite interesting too. So I don't know how that kind of bodes as far as the role of sort of the populace is concerned, if they feel that they've got a role, or whether it's simply kind of like a symbolic type of relationship that sort of takes place on a sort of an archetypal or a sort of like a symbolic level between kind of populace and sort of monarch. It's an interesting one. But on the more positive side, we've got Venus separating from a sextile to Jupiter. You can see Venus here in the 11th house in Gemini, and Jupiter is here still in Aries in the 10th house, so quite prominent. I think this really symbolizes kind of pomp and ceremony, something the Brits really do quite well. And I think it's going to give us sort of a nice upbeat, effervescent atmosphere to the day. It'll be part of a long weekend. The weather's improving. A lot of people are having street parties or going on picnics, and so I think it will really kind of lift the spirits of the Brits, who've certainly not had an easy time, what with strikes and cost of living crises and that kind of thing. I think we really kind of need something to sort of uplift and to sort of buoy everybody's spirits, much like the Platinum Jubilee did last year. The Platinum Jubilee of the Queen. And then the final thing is that Mars will be in a grand trine with the Moon and Neptune. So I think that should alleviate, any potential resentment or tension that's created by that Uranus-Moon opposition. You can see Mars here in Cancer in the 12th house, and it's very close to the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, and the Arabic part of nobility. So I think that bodes quite well. In terms of like processions and marches. I think that's really going to sort of resonate with people, that whole kind of ritual aspect. And then you can see Neptune is here in Pisces in the 9th house, which is again a house associated with kind of ceremony, with kind of the laws of the land, with beliefs and faith, that type of thing. So a strong kind of ritual aspect to this whole thing that will flow, because we're talking about a kind of a grand water trine, and possibly the music will be quite moving too. Neptune is closely associated with music, and then on the other side we've got the Moon. So I think it'll be interesting to see his choice of music, what happens with it as far as the marches and the sort of rituals are concerned. He is said to have made some modernizations to aspects of the ritual. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that kind of falls. But to me, it looks as though it will kind of land well with people and will really sort of help things to flow quite smoothly. So I think overall a really interesting chart. I mean, the last thing I do want to mention is Regulus. Now, this is the star considered to be one of the king stars, if you like, and in the sort of Western tropical system, it's now sitting at 0 degrees of Virgo, so very much associated with the sacred feminine. But you can see that it forms part of a grand trine with a galactic center here. This is the galactic center. And then to the North Node, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And yes, so with the North Node, and as well as Venus also kind of keys in via a sextile, so it kind of makes a kite actually. And as I say, Regulus is considered the king star. It was really important, I think, at the I don't know if it was the crowning of William the Conqueror, but generally speaking, in terms of European ability, it's considered an important star for astrologers. And so it's interesting that it's connecting the second house, the fifth house, and the 10th house, which is of course the house of kind of kingship, of social status, of public titles and responsibilities. So kind of linking up the second house of worth and of money and possessions, and then the fifth house of creativity, children, that kind of thing. So there's a strong element here of legacy, of kind of giving back, and I think of self-sufficiency as well, potentially. We could see the monarchy becoming more and more financially self-sufficient under Charles. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out over the course of time. Finally, I just want to mention the part of suns here in the 6th house, which hopefully kind of bodes well. I mean, I understand Harry is supposed to be attending the ceremony, which I think means quite a lot to Charles to have both his sons kind of in attendance. And you can see that the part of suns makes a trine to both the sun, so representing the king, and then to Mercury, which is close by here in Taurus. It is retrograde. So, I mean, to me, it's kind of interesting because Harry is a sun sign Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury. And Mercury being retrograde, it's like the return of the prodigal son, the return of the son home to sort of see his father being crowned. So I think it's very interesting and symbolic. And I do hope that they manage to sort of mend their fences and find a way forward. We don't like to see any family kind of, with rifts and that kind of thing. So hopefully this will be another opportunity to try and mend some fences. Now, just going back to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, I thought it was interesting to see some of the overlaps here. Not all the same, but there are some planets that are kind of recurring in terms of their importance. So again, as you can see, we've got Leo rising, the sign of the king or the queen. And we've also got Pluto quite strongly figured here, rising on the ascendant in the 12th house. Pluto here rules the 4th house, so there's a strong sense of, the sort of the death of her father hanging over proceedings, because of course, the IC points to family roots, to lineage, and so on. And Pluto in and of itself tends to be about kind of this death and rebirth. So we can see this kind of Oroboros happening with her coronation, sort of the death of her father and her now kind of taking over the reins. And you can see that Pluto forms part of a great big kite formation here that's got, it sort of brings in the sun, which is, as I said, the sign of the ruler. It brings in Mars and Mercury, which are in conjunction here. And then down at the bottom, we've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, which is quite unusual, actually. And finally, the moon on the descendant. So, again, representing the populace or the people. So this is her pledging herself to the people to do this job for the rest of her life, which of course she did. And then you could sort of see this 11th house sort of as being possibly something to do with the role of the prince consort, her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. He had Gemini quite strongly in his chart. So this may have had something to do with his contribution. And also the processions of the time, I think, would have been quite spectacular. Her in her gold coach and sort of appearing on a balcony, all those things that have become part and parcel of what we expect from the monarchy, she kind of invented, and sort of it became a sort of a signature of the monarchy in the television era. So, it may have something to do with those marches and processions and so on there. And then the Saturn-Neptune down the bottom is also kind of interesting. First of all, Saturn ruling that 6th house of, her job. So this, and remember that Saturn was very prominent on the midheaven of her chart. And then we've got Neptune here, which rules the 8th house. But it's in the 3rd house. So this is her kind of making her oaths, her solemn oaths of service, and sort of a kind of like a power sharing, if you like, because she did reign under a constitutional monarchy, which means that Parliament, makes all the laws, but, she is the sort of the head of state, the sort of ceremonial kind of head of state. And I think that's kind of symbolized by this partnership, if you like, of Saturn and Neptune in Libra, which is very much about kind of partnership. So I think quite fascinating, actually. So that's all I really want to kind of say. I don't want to make this too long. As I mentioned, I probably will be writing a more detailed article on my Astro Insights blog, where I do a lot of different articles about astrology and the royal family, including this one about Princess Diana. So check it out if you're interested. I will definitely be doing a profile of Charles in terms of his astrology and human design going forward. So that's something else to look forward to. But yeah, I hope that you've enjoyed this, that it's been illuminating in some way. Enjoy the coronation weekend if you're in the UK, and all the very best for the upcoming summer months.